So the question comes up, how do I protect my assets? If you have a business and there's a severe economic downturn, that business might suffer. It might even need to go bankrupt, but what do we do to protect all of your assets as a whole? And why does it matter? Hey there, Paul Goyette here again from Goyette, Ruano, and Thompson, and today I'm going to talk about asset protection and how to protect your assets. Now, we represent a number of companies, fairly high net worth individuals, clients involved in transactions where fairly large amounts or very large amounts of money are generated. So the question comes up, how do I protect my assets? And what I mean by that, it's not just your money. It could be your business, it could be your real property, it could be your investments, it means all of your personal assets. And protect from what? Well, it means protected from creditors, from lawsuits, from liability out there, possibly even from the government, and also from economic downturns. If you have a business and there's a severe economic downturn, that business might suffer. It might even need to go bankrupt, but what do we do to protect all of your assets as a whole? And why does it matter? Well, be aware, especially in California, but in the United States generally, but especially in California, it is a very litigious environment. People sue for anything and everything. There's also an interesting societal thing going on right now where there are a lot of very entitled people out there. So if you're a hard worker, you have made a lot of smart decisions over the course of your life, you've accumulated a certain amount of assets, trust me, there are a large amount of people out there, and I'm sure you've run into them, who want a piece of that just because you have it and they don't. And they will try to get it by whatever means available. So what I'm going to talk about today are some basic ways. I'm not going to go way down into the weeds, but I'm going to talk about like a 30,000 foot level, what some of the basic methods are of protecting your assets. Now, one rule you can apply to all asset protection is that asset protection has to be done in advance. It has to be done weeks or months and sometimes years in advance to be done correctly. You can't do asset protection after the fact, after you've been sued, after you've had some major health issue, after there's been some huge economic downturn. You can't go back at that point and protect your assets nearly as effectively. Now think of it this way. By asset protection, what we're doing is creating a shield or a barrier from creditors of any kind, or people that are interested in your money, your assets, and from you. And there's a number of ways of doing that we recommend. And the first is there's corporate structuring. There's all kinds of corporate structuring that should be done. And I'm sure if you have a business or a number of businesses, you've set up various types of corporations, which I've talked about in other episodes before, ranging from LLCs to various types of corporations. And think of it this way, corporations are separate entities. They're separate entities, separate and apart from you personally. So as a separate entity, they have a life of their own, so to speak, and they can be protected. So for example, when I mentioned a moment ago about economic downturns, if there's a severe economic downturn that dramatically and negatively affects your business, you might have to bankrupt that business out, but you can do so where you could close down that individual corporation or LLC, whatever it might be, but you could protect the rest of your assets and your other companies, the rest of your empire, if you will. So corporate structuring is a good place to start. Also, we always recommend that you have appropriate insurances in place. And this can be very basic stuff from just having underinsured and uninsured motorist coverage on your automobile insurance, to have an appropriate liability insurance for all of your companies. And as a high net worth individual, you should have umbrella insurance of various kinds. It's not very expensive, and you can get $2, $3, $4, even $5 million of umbrella insurance for a relatively small amount of money. So I always recommend that where possible, get appropriate insurances in place as a stopgap to any liability that might come up. Another basic thing that is often overlooked by people is do background checks on the people you get involved with, especially the people you get involved with from a business perspective. If you have investors coming into your companies, if you take on business partners, even if you hire employees, do background checks. You can do very thorough background checks now for not a lot of money and find out what the history of these people are. And in particular, besides the obvious criminal convictions and bankruptcies or fraud allegations that you look for, look to whether they've been involved in a lot of litigation. Are they a particularly litigious individual that files lawsuits and claims on a regular basis? You'd be surprised. There are some people that live their lives that way, and if you find someone who's a particularly litigious person, Do not get involved with them, because if they've been involved in a lot of litigation before, it will only be a matter of time until they involve you and your companies in litigation. Now, what I'm going to talk mostly about today in asset protection is trust establishment. So trusts are a great way to protect your assets if done correctly. And what you're doing essentially with a trust is you are creating another separate entity that's separate and apart from you, where you are going to place that asset. And trust can hold all kinds of assets, from money held in various types of bank and financial institution accounts, to real property, to businesses, to personal property, even vehicles can be put into trust. The way to think of trust is you're separating the asset from your personal property. So that's what's going to create the asset protection. Speaking of trusts, most of you are thinking right now, well, I have a trust. Well, what you probably have, if you set up a trust for your family, and some people have, and many people haven't. So what you have probably set up is a revocable living trust. A revocable living trust is great for some things, but it's not good for asset protection. And the reason it's not good is because of that keyword revocable. What a revocable living trust is good for is organizing your assets and to be distributed upon your death. And so your assets don't go through probate, which costs a lot of time, costs a lot of money, and creates a lot of uncertainty. So revocable living trusts are very good for that. What they're not good for is asset protection. Because of the very word revocable, they can be revoked by you. You've set the trust up, and you are the establisher, or settler is the word, of the trust. You are creating the trust. And if it's revocable, you have access to that money. You can revoke the trust document and you can pull that asset right out of the trust. Therefore, it is not a good mechanism to protect that asset from liability that might be out there. Now, the type of trust that does protect your assets is an irrevocable trust. That's where you take your assets, you place them into a trust, and it's irrevocable. You can no longer get access to those assets unless a variety of things happen that are not likely to happen. That trust is run by a trustee. The trustee, who's usually a hired professional, but not always. And I'll talk about that in a second as to who should be the trustees of these trusts. But that trustee runs the trust. They determine how the trust assets are to be distributed, and it's not up to you any longer. Now, irrevocable trusts are very effective in protecting your assets. So if you place your assets into an irrevocable trust, creditors will not have access to it. The government will not have access to an irrevocable trust. And I want to be clear, my advice on asset protection is legal asset protection. We're not helping you dodge legal tax obligations, but what we are helping you do is preserve your hard-earned assets so that you can use them at some later point in your life, or you can distribute them to people in your life as you desire. Irrevocable trusts are set up a variety of ways, but they tend to be set up for the benefit of some third-party beneficiary out there. Usually it's a spouse, it could be children, it could be relatives, it could be a charitable endeavor where you've set up a foundation that's in an irrevocable trust where you place your assets and your money in there. There's also can be significant tax benefits to setting up irrevocable trusts where you place your assets, where you may get credit for gifting large sums of money to an irrevocable trust. But think of it this way, that what you're doing is you're losing control of this asset. You're placing it in an irrevocable trust for the benefit of someone such as your spouse, your kids, some charitable organization, some other people out there. It could be whoever you want, but the trustee takes control at that point, and you no longer have access or control over your assets. You have to think about that before you place your assets into an irrevocable trust. But they're very effective for asset protection. Now, there is one very interesting and widely used possible exception to the revocable trust, irrevocable trust dichotomy I just talked about, and that's domestic asset protection trusts, DAPTs they call it. And what a domestic asset protection trust is technically, it's a trust set up by the creator or the settler that is irrevocable, but you can have access to those assets under certain circumstances, and it does create a very nice asset protection structure. Now, the thing with domestic asset protection trusts is they're only allowed in certain states. So you need to research what state you're residing in and what state you want to set your domestic asset protection trust up in. Many states don't allow for them, but a number of states do. Nevada is one that's very, very common, Wyoming and South Dakota. You don't have to live in that state to set up a domestic asset protection trust. You could live, for example, where I am here in California. You could set that domestic asset protection trust up in Nevada, and you have to hire a trustee located in the state where you establish that trust, which is fine, which you might want to do anyway. Now, there are some exceptions to asset protection there. So, for example, there is some case law out there that says a judgment from a non-domestic asset protection trust state may in fact be enforceable against your domestic asset protection trust in a state such as Nevada. There's split case law on that, but there are cases that say that. So you have to know that if you have a judgment against you from a non-domestic asset protection state, it might be levied against your trust in that state. Now remember, the same rules apply here on all these trusts. You have to set your domestic asset protection trust up before you get sued, before you have a judgment against you. In bankruptcy, for example, there's a rule in bankruptcy court, there's a clawback period or a look-back period that can be up to 10 years. So for example, if you create a trust to protect your assets on a Monday and you file for bankruptcy on Tuesday, guaranteed that bankruptcy court will be able to reach back that to one day and get access to those assets for distribution to your creditors in the bankruptcy. They can reach back as much as 10 years, but there's no bright line as to how far they'll reach back. They typically won't reach back more than 10 years, and oftentimes many years less than that. But the advice we give is set that trust up as soon as you think you need it. Hopefully you never go through a bankruptcy, hopefully you never have a big liability event, but the further in advance you have that trust established before that liability event occurs, the better. The next type of trust that is very interesting that you might be able to use for forms of asset protection is a special needs trust. Now, a special needs trust is set up for a beneficiary who has special needs, usually special healthcare needs. So for example, many times parents will set up a special needs trust for a disabled child who's a disabled child becomes a disabled adult and will need care their entire life. Other times, special needs trusts are set up for other people who might need help in one way or another. You can, in fact, there are some ways you can set up a special needs trust for yourself. For example, if you're injured severely in an automobile accident and there's a big personal injury settlement, you can place that settlement into a special needs trust for your ongoing and future medical care. But there's a couple things with special needs trusts you need to be aware of. Like these other trusts, there's going to be a trustee that's appointed. The trustee will distribute that money to the beneficiary. Let's say it's your disabled child, or let's say it's you with a disability. It'll be up to the trustee as to how they distribute those assets. Also, a special needs trust will have what's called a spendthrift provision in that trust. Most trusts have spendthrift provisions in their trust, but you have to have one in a special needs trust. And what that means is the trustee is under restrictions to be thrifty, if you will, with the assets in the trust. They cannot waste those assets. So for example, courts have determined that paying out creditors on judgments is not an obligation the trustee has. So a spendthrift trust will protect the beneficiary from liability, judgments, creditors, and so forth out there. Wouldn't necessarily protect you, but you've placed those assets into a special needs trust with a spendthrift provision, and therefore the beneficiary is protected from any creditors or liability that may be attempted to be levied against that trust asset, if that makes sense. And there's some trusts that are set up just purely as spendthrift trusts, where the settlor or the creator of the trust might set up a spendthrift trust for a beneficiary who doesn't know how to manage their money. We've represented wealthy individuals who set up spendthrift trusts for the distribution of a certain amount of money to their kids who are wholly irresponsible, or a kid who's wholly irresponsible for one reason or another. And so they'll place a certain sum of money into a spendthrift trust that is governed by the trustee, and the trustee will be under direction from the trust document as to how much money he or she can distribute to this child over the course of time. What it ensures is the assets of the trust are protected and ensures the beneficiary gets what the settlor wants, which is long-term, sometimes lifetime, usually long-term care and support for those particular beneficiaries. So those are some examples of irrevocable trusts that can be used to protect your assets. And what I spoke about here are domestic trusts. Those are all done here in the United States, and for a domestic asset protection trust, like I mentioned a moment ago, those have to be established in certain states that allow for them. So if you're interested in that and you contact us, we will have a state picked out for you, depending on where you're located and some other factors that we could set that trust up in. What I'll talk about in the next episode will be international trusts, which include offshore trusts, offshore banking, and offshore corporate structuring, which adds a different layer of protection. All of these, by the way, all of this asset protection stuff we're doing here is designed to protect your assets in a legal way. It doesn't work for tax evasion. So if you think you could set up a trust, hide your assets from the government, never pay taxes again, no, you're entirely wrong. You're gonna have to pay taxes on monies you've earned under the tax statutes wherever you happen to reside. But for protecting your assets, trusts are a very important tool, and when used in conjunction with appropriate corporate structuring that have appropriate insurances, then you're golden in terms of protecting your assets if you do it correctly and you do it in advance of the liability event that could affect your trust asset. And thanks so much for listening and watching today. If you like this video and you found it to be helpful, please give me a like and please subscribe to our channel, and then let us know if we can be of any help to you. We'd love to help you on this, and we'd like to help you preserve and protect your assets.